Hey everyone, Tactics here with another Season 3 tank guide, where this time we're going to be diving into Protection Paladins, discussing what is new going into patch 11.2, some raid and mythic plus talent options, tips for optimizing your rotation and survivability, plus a lot more. On top of that, I've also put together a written guide that you can go through, which is over on the Method website and linked down below. And that's something that I'm going to be keeping updated over the course of this patch as things change. Plus, it's going to have some of the things that this video is going to not include, like basics of what abilities do and how the general paladin class functions. It's going to have things like talent explanations as well as hero tree explanations, recommended consumables and enchants, basically all that kind of stuff that hasn't really changed over the course of this expansion that I can exclude from this video to save a bit of time and reduce repetition for any returning viewers. With that said, let's hop into all of the changes that prop paladins have received going into this patch, which is absolutely nothing. There is no changes. Apologies for getting baited. It's all holy and red stuff. Nothing for prot specifically. That being said, I'm sure if you're someone that has been watching PTR content, you have noticed a bit of a resurgence of prop paladins in Mythic Plus, and the reason for that is not due to changes of the class, as you can see from this, but actually a bit of a change in how the dungeon pool operates in terms of what tank damage intake looks like. In Season 2, we saw this shift away from magic tank busters, with it heavily favoring melee intake, which is something that prot paladin is a bit weak against. And moving into Season 3, we see them peeling back a little bit on that, where you're seeing a lot more bleeds, a lot more debuffs in general, and a lot more bolt hits, which is all things that prop paladin is very, very good against. That combined with a pretty strong tier set bonus, as we're going to see, as well as just what appears to be generally lower tank damage intake across the board, means that paladin's going to have fewer survivability issues, their damage is more competitive, and they're just a more attractive choice because of that insane utility package that they provide. So fear not, prot paladins, you are looking solid in both raid and mythic plus going into Season 3 despite no actual changes. Now, no changes doesn't mean no new stuff, and of course there's going to be new tier bonuses coming in the patch, like I just alluded to. And this time there's a new experiment done by Blizzard where the tier bonuses are tied to the hero tree, so prot's getting a different option for Lightsmith and Templar, and these are both pretty nice, honestly, in my opinion, though there is a clear winner. To start, we do have Templar as the bonus, so right off the bat, your Empyrean hammers deal 20% increased critical strike damage, and its criticals have a 50% chance to grant an additional stack of Light's Deliverance, meaning that there's some crit synergy here. When you crit, 50% chance that these hammers are going to give you an additional stack, and you need 60 of those stacks to get your free Hammer of the Light, which means more Hammer of the Lights. Woo, we love that. Moving on to the 4-piece. Your Hammer of Light deals more damage against its primary target, and it strikes 3 additional secondary targets. Plus, it can be cast an additional time after you Eye of Tear. So that means when you Eye of Tear, you get back-to-back Hammer of Light cast. Hammer of Light is dealing more damage, both in single target and in AoE. And then your 2-piece is also feeding into that Hammer of Light damage increase because it's giving you further additional Hammer of Light. So basically, it's all about Hammer of Lighting a ton, which is a great tier bonus because Hammer of Light is by far the best button press for Templar. It feels great to press. There's a ton of damage. It also has some defensiveness with the absorb shield it's giving you. On top of that, it's going to make it way easier to maintain that Shake the Heavens buff. So kind of across the board, this is a pretty big W tier set. I think if you enjoy Templar, this is just going to emphasize all the things that you enjoy about playing Templar. Now, moving on to Lightsmith here. Let me change my specs real quick. This is another one that actually has some crit synergy on the 2-piece here. So right off the bat here, the 2-piece bonus for this one is Hammer and Anvil's damage increased by 15%, and it can also be activated by Blessed Hammer or Hammer of the Righteous at 40% effectiveness. So basically, this is another source of getting that crit proc, which deals a pretty substantial amount of damages uncapped. So in AoE, it is better, but it's not anything to scoff at in single target either. The 4-piece here, Hammer and Anvil, also grants a stack of Masterwork. This is a new buff, and that causes your next Holy Armament to cast one lesser version of itself on a nearby ally for each stack. And so basically how this works is the lesser version is either a weapon, which deals I think 3 attacks or 2 attacks or something that does some holy damage, or it's a shield that is a smaller shield that doesn't grow over time. And essentially it's just some more damage from your weapons, assuming you cast with full Masterwork stacks. This buff stacks at 5. That's the cap of the thing. And any Masterwork stacks that you gain over that cap actually spit out a lesser holy armament. So it actually gives you chances to get more lesser bulwarks and more lesser weapons if you are already capped on masterwork. So there is a reason to be capped, which leads to some interesting gameplay decisions, which we'll talk about later on. In general, the 5 masterwork stacks is very, very easy to come by in a Mythic Plus environment, again, because of that Blessed Hammer hitting multiple targets. Very easy to get a crit and a proc in that sense, which gives you that masterwork stack. In single target, specifically if you're playing that Hammer of the Righteous build, this is a bit harder to actually do. It takes a bit longer to actually build it up if you're a little unlucky. But again, one of the reasons why there's a lot of crit synergy, you stack more crit, and that makes it a bit more consistent to build that up, which will lead to more lesser weapon procs, which leads to more damage. And this is the one that seems to be pulling ahead in terms of output. So it is looking like, if you're someone who's looking to min-max, that it'll be a Lightsmith tier, both in Mythic Plus and in Raid, though I don't think Templar is super far behind. So if you really just dislike Lightsmith, you just want to play the Templar version of things, totally fine. It's a very slight DPS loss, but if you enjoy Templar, play that for sure. But for the min-maxers, Lightsmith is definitely pulling ahead. From there, we can talk a bit about talent builds, where there aren't a ton of differences across the class and the spec tree when it comes to Templar versus Lightsmith. Obviously, there are some differences in Mythic Plus and Raid, so we will cover those. But I am not going to show 4 builds for Lightsmith and Templar in both forms of content. I will link builds down in the description below, though, if you want those, and of course they'll be linked on the Method website as well. So starting with the Mythic Plus build here, you have some flexibility in this tree. Obviously, if you do not need Cleanse Toxins, this can be moved into like Imperial Ward for some lay on hands armor. There's also an argument to be made that maybe you should drop some of this later stuff down there. That can always be picked up. Keep that in mind, because of course Lightsmith does have a significantly reduced cooldown on lay on hands. Other things that can be moved around, obviously 1 minute sack, which I have already moved around. Actually, this would probably be defaulted, but this can be moved around. You can grab this freedom speed if you want it. You can grab or drop Blessing of Protection if you want it. The other thing you can drop is Lightforge Blessing, because we're actually using Lead the Charge to pat down both this area, so it is not actually required. You can also drop Consecrated Ground for a slightly smaller Consecrate. And with these points, you can do things like pick up Obduracy. You can pick up that Imperial War like I talked about. You can pick up this Unbound Freedom here like I talked about. So there's a few little points that you can move around here as needed. Also, Righteous Protection is going to be pretty good in some of the dungeons here for the poison immunity, specifically in Arakara at the beginning and on the last boss. It's pretty strong. So this is something you will want to consider from time to time. Moving to the actual spec tree, in general, you're pretty much always going to be playing Blessed Hammer in dungeons. And this is a pretty standard build here. The main thing about Lightsmith is technically these Eye of Tyr points are flexible. Really, you're almost always going to play Eye of Tyr, the base ability, I think. Uther's Counsel back in Season 1 was double the strength of this, so it's not really a spell you're heavily considering, but some pretty often, or pretty common substitutions, I think, is dropping Inmost Light and either grabbing Moment of Glory for additional caster lockdown and a cooldown in certain dungeons, or even Bastion of Light for that ability in certain dungeons. But baseline, leaving this in Inmost Light, I think, is pretty standard. Up in this tree, obviously, we do get an even more Lay on Hand CDR to synergize with this Lay on Hand CDR that we already have. And that's because we are choosing to, of course, path through Faith in the Light in order to help us reach that 100% spell block breakpoint, as opposed to going through Sanctuary and Consecration Flame. If you're doing lower keys and just kind of vibing, you can put these points in instead of Faith in the Light, just to make it easier to consecrate and stay in your consecrate buff, and also have your consecrate do more damage. That is a possibility, but if you're someone pushing keys, I think this is a pretty standard build to run here. Next up, we can shift over to the Raid build, where once again the general tree and the spec tree are pretty similar among both Lightsmith and Templar. So moving down here, you generally don't need the Dispel or these CCs. You can pick them up if you really want to, by the way. If you drop these things here, totally fine to pick those up, but we're going to default to not having it. Obduracy is a droppable point. If you just want Unbound Freedom, you can get Unbound Freedom. If you want Punishment for some reason, you get Punishment. Consecrated Ground, similarly, is a droppable point. You can do the same things. Blessing of Protection is a droppable point. You can move it here, or if you need CDR on Blessing of Protection and Spell Warding, you can get the second point. That's something you can do. 1 minute sack, or Recompense, depending on the situation. If you don't need 1 minute sack, you can use Recompense for some damage, or you can drop this entirely and move it around as needed, as we mentioned. Anything here, I'm picking up a little bit of the off healing. These numbers are all like pretty tiny, and really like none of these talents are super important to grab. Like if you're not grabbing these two, you can just move this over, grab this one for pathing, and grab this one for pathing. And then similarly, if you're doing this, you can drop Lightforge Blessing. So it's really, at this point, the decisions are not super impactful. This is a little bit more healing taken when you specifically have Ardent Defender up, but it's not super strong. And again, this is 3% speed essentially. But this gives you a little bit more consistent off healing. This one anyways, this one's terrible. But yeah, you know, you can kind of play what you want. It's not really a big deal. The other thing is it's not really a big loss to not play eye for an eye, because in raids you're not tanking the boss as often as a prop paladin specifically, and just also, you know, there's 2 tanks tanking the stuff, right, versus Mythic Plus where it's always you tanking. So this is much better in Mythic Plus compared to raid. It's basically terrible in raid in my opinion, unless you're perma tanking on a specific fight. And so, you know, you have a lot of flexibility here, but none of the points really matter. So, you know, do whatever you want. Do what makes you feel happy. In the Lightsmith tree, we are opting for Blessed Assurance in raid, which means that we are opting for Hammer of the Righteous. This makes it so that your Hammer of Righteous is hit like trucks, which is pretty nice, assuming you are weaving it in with your Holy Power Spenders to get that damage amp. So that's the main change. Otherwise, you also have a ton of flex points in the raid. So what can we actually drop in this raid? So first off, both Inspiring Vanguard and Barricade of Faith are movable points. You can do things like pick up the Holy Power CDR and Lay on Hands, or if there's a fight with a lot of dot damage, then Light of the Titans can be good. I mean, thinking about it, I think it's like the 4th boss has a really long dot, but I'm not sure there's any other significant dots. Maybe there's one in like phase 2 of Dementius, but who knows if that's actually going to be relevant. The other thing you can do with these points, if there is not a lot of targets and you're just like, I want some damage, you can go bang bang. If you don't need spell warding, you can go in Inspiring Vanguard as well. If you do need spell warding, I can go back. Say it is an AoE fight, maybe you can go into Soaring Shield, right? Get that, move down the tree. If single target's no longer relevant because you're always cleaving things on something like Soul Hunters, you can drop Focus Enmity entirely, and you can do something like, hey, maybe I want a little bit more parry against this boss. Maybe I want Bubble Taunt against this boss. Maybe I need even more CDR on like Spell Warding, Bop, and Divine Shield, and Lay on Hands even. So you can kind of shift these points around as needed. You have a lot of flexibility options as a paladin. The other thing you can do, Crusader's Resolve is pretty strong on some bosses that melee very, very hard. So don't sleep on that one. You can also, of course, put this into more defensive stuff, right? If we want to go over here into Barricade of Faith, and we all of a sudden are like, you know, we actually do want our spell block, maybe we can start doing this. Stuff like that, and then we can move this back into like Bubble Taunt, or you can move this into Uther's Council, that kind of thing. You know, we can just throw it into Inspiring Vanguard plus Barricade of Faith as well for some default stuff. But you know, there's a lot of flexibility in this tree, and you will see it kind of vary from fight to fight based on what you need. So do not be afraid to mess around with these points in this tree based on the actual fight itself. What is needed for that fight? Is there value in melee damage reduction? Am I hitting one target for a lot of it? Is there 5 targets sometimes in the fight, or oftentimes in the fight? There's no one build fits all for the spec tree specifically, which is a really cool part about Prop Paladin. I would say like there's a lot of different things you can do that are strong for different reasons on boss fights. So this one's really interesting, and I talk about it a bit more in the method guide as well. Okay, so we've gone through the talent builds. Let's talk rotational stuff, starting with the Season 3 frontrunner, Lightsmith. Note that for these priorities, I am passing over discussing things like Avenging Wrath and Divine Toll, which are generally just things that you're going to be sending on cooldown unless they would be wasted, since the best thing for damage is to just maximize your total number of uses. Now, for Lightsmith, a big part of your rotation is whether you're speccing to Divine Guidance or Blessed Assurance. For the former, you'll want to track those stacks and make sure you drop a Consecrate whenever you hit 5, even if it's a little earlier than you normally would, because that is a big damage hit and it prevents you from wasting any of those stacks. For the latter, you just want to make sure that as much as possible, whenever you use a Holy Power Spender, you are using a Blessed Hammer or Hammer of the Righteous cast before the next spender is used, just to maximize the damage amp that talent provides. The other main thing you want to do is ensure you never waste Sacred Weapon uptime, meaning clipping your Sacred Weapon by casting one when you have one active with more than 5 seconds left is a big no-no. The other thing to keep in mind is the new tier bonus, where you'll ideally want to try and use Avenging Wrath as well as your regular cast of Sacred Weapon when you have 5 stacks of Masterwork in order to maximize the amount of lesser weapons going out. That being said, you still do want to send your first Avenging Wrath on pull of a boss fight or the first pull in a Mythic Plus dungeon just right away at 0 stacks, because it isn't worth delaying it by 30 plus seconds that it could take in like a single target situation to actually get your first 5 Masterworks. The tier bonus also has an interesting side effect where if you're trying to maximize damage, you want to immediately fire off your Holy Bulwark right after your Sacred Weapon with 0 stacks of Masterwork so that you can just build back up to 5 stacks of Masterwork and sit at 5 stacks until your next wings, which allows you to crank out more lesser weapons from that rollover buff that I talked about earlier, where if you gain a Masterwork stack beyond the cap, it turns into a lesser armament. Obviously, if you're thinking about how much shielding you're putting out on your group, this is worse for that, but the lesser bulwarks individually aren't super impactful, so it's not a giant loss, and something to consider if you're trying to optimize damage. Outside of this, the stuff is pretty straightforward. Don't want to cap on your resource in Holy Power. You want to maintain Consecrate and your defensive buffs as needed. You want to use Hammer of Wrath and Judgment and your other hammer generator in order to have a good resource economy. And then you use your free Word of Glory cast, which Lightsmith gets a ton of, to either heal yourself or get that big block buff preemptively, which has the positive side effect of also CDRing your Holy Armament and, of course, your Lay on Hands. When it comes to Templar, the main difference is the lack of Avenger's Shield priority, as this is one of the few abilities you have that will not actually extend your important Shake the Heavens buff. That being said, technically, it can extend it thanks to the punishment talent in the general tree, which causes successful interrupts to launch a Blessed Hammer off, and that hammer does extend Shake the Heavens. So effectively, if you interrupt something with Avenger's Shield, it counts as a Blessed Hammer cast, which is important for also maintaining those defensive buffs, making it a very worthwhile GCD. Now, Templar wouldn't be Templar without Hammer of Light, which we're now getting a whole lot more of with the Season 3 bonus. Remember that since this is a Holy Power spender, it does benefit from the Blessing of Dawn 30% damage amp, so you will want to make sure that whenever you use this ability, you have a Dawn charge available to be consumed. On top of that, now that you have these back-to-back casts, there's another little min-max thing that you can do by spacing out your Hammer of Lights by at least 6 seconds in order to maximize your uptime on the Undisputed Ruling Haste buff. As a side effect, delaying also delays that automatic Consecrate a bit, meaning you'll need to spend less overall globals on this over the course of an encounter, which frees up globals to do other things. As a warning, remember that you do have only 12 seconds to fire off each Hammer of the Light, and I think the number is 20 seconds for the Eye of Tier second press of Hammer of Light, so do not hold these for so long that your proc fizzles, as that is the worst thing that can happen. The only other notable thing for Templar is using Word of Glory, because that can actually be a DPS increase because of the Hammerfall talent, which causes spenders to call down more of those hammers. So if you don't have a strong button to press and you aren't worried about Shake the Heavens uptime, pressing this healing ability can actually be a damage increase. Other than that, all the Paladin rotational basics that I just talked about for Lightsmith are the same for Templar, so no changes there. With the rotational stuff finished, let's talk a bit more about defensive layers and cooldowns available to Protection Paladins in order to help them survive. To start, you've got both the iconic Paladin ability and your main active mitigation ability in Consecrate and Shield of the Righteous, which are 2 buffs that you're going to want to maintain at as close to 100% uptime as possible, as together they create the baseline of your durability against all forms of damage, including the ability to block periodic effects thanks to your mastery, which is going to be useful in a lot of these Season 3 dungeons. In raid environments, particularly in higher movement fights, I know Consecrate can be a bit problematic to maintain, and in those situations, you've got the Sanctuary talent, which essentially gives you a 4-second grace period to redrop it without you losing the buff. That is a huge quality of life boost in those specific situations, so make sure you keep it in mind. Now, layering on to these defensives are a few different buffs that you can maintain, some of them at a very high, again, close to 100% uptime, whereas others have a much lower uptime and you need to choose when to obtain them. For the full uptime buff, there's two tied to Avenger's Shield. First is Barricade of Faith, which gives 10% block for 10 seconds, and the other is a choice node between Strength and Adversity, which is used in Mythic Plus, and grants up to 15% parry for 15 seconds. The other is that raid one, potentially, in heavy hitting melee fights, and that's Crusader's Resolve, which reduces melee damage taken by 10% for 10 seconds. Basically, what this boils down to is to maintain these buffs, you just want to make sure you Avenger's Shield every 10 seconds. Pretty straightforward. Outside of that, there's an additional 30% block buff that lasts for 6 seconds when you cast Word of Glory from the Faith in the Light talent. And this is the one that I mentioned earlier that will allow you to maintain 100% spell block when you use it. That being said, of course, it is tied to one of your spenders and it's a relatively short buff, so it is not going to have 100% uptime, so you need to pick your moments with this ability. Specifically very strong when you're taking a lot of spell or dot damage. Of course, you don't necessarily need to always use this for the block gain. You can just use your free Word of Glories, particularly the ones from that Shining Light buff, as needed to top yourself when you're low health. Besides these actively maintained buffs, there's a passive pseudo cheat death effect from Gift of the Golden Valkyr, which is quite powerful. It procs a 50% DR for 4 seconds when you go below 30% health, and it applies to the damage taken, and that's on a 45-second cooldown. So super frequent, extremely powerful, probably worth tracking so that you know when you have that extra line of defense available. Next up, I've got to mention Paladin's signature cooldown Avenging Wrath, which is a significant boost to your offense and defense, making it something that you want to hit as often as possible in order to maximize the number of uses over a dungeon or raid encounter. There are times when you'd want to hold it a little bit and say there's like a damage amp coming up, for example, or if you're fighting a pack that's about to die, or if it's the end of a boss fight and you want this for the beginning of the next pull, that kind of thing. But in general, you just want to press it if you're going to get full value of that button press. In terms of the specifics of this ability, it is a flat increase to your damage done, your healing done, your holy power generation, and your crit. The holy power gain in particular is quite important as it kind of fuels this feedback loop of spending holy power in order to reduce the cooldown of many of your abilities, including Wings itself, thanks to the Righteous Protector talent. And at the same time, both Judgment and Hammer of Wrath can actually extend Wings to be longer while it's active, thanks to Zealot's Paragon in the class tree, meaning the more of these buttons you press, the longer you'll sit in Wings, leading to more cooldown reduction of Wings, leading to more overall Wings uptime. So very, very important to maximize your Wings window for your overall output and uptime of this ability. If you haven't played Paladin in a while, you're probably wondering what happened to that defensive Wings bonus in Sentinel, and basically we have not used it all expansion because of some of the duration nerfs it got going into this expansion, which basically absolutely destroyed that feedback loop that I just mentioned, leading to massively reduced Wings uptime when you play the defensive Wings versus these more offense-oriented Wings. And since this is also giving you a healing increase as well as a crit increase, which has defensive benefit, you're better off using the crit Wings. From there, we have the suite of damage reduction cooldowns available to Paladin, where there are 3 at your disposal, with the most used being Ardent Defender, thanks to its extremely short cooldown, as well as cooldown reduction you gain from spending Holy Power. This relatively small DR has the added bonus of being a cheat death while it's active, which is an effect that you can take advantage of if you don't have enough defensive coverage for some significant hits. On a similarly short cooldown is Eye of Tyr, which also has a bit of offensive upside for Lightsmith and is, of course, intertwined with the Templar hero tree. For Templar, this is something you rip basically on cooldown because of that, but for Lightsmith, you have a bit more options available. You can be a bit more particular. You can sit on this for a little bit of time, but you don't want to sit on it for too long because it can just be used to smooth damage intake and do a bit of damage, especially if you're talented into Inmost Light, which drastically increases its damage done and drops the cooldown from 1 minute to 40 seconds. So very, very short, something you don't want to waste uses of. Last up is Guardian of Ancient Kings, your big 50% DR on a longer cooldown. But once again, this is something that can be CDR'd not only by casting Holy Power spenders, but also from Avenger's Shield, where you get 1 second of CDR per target hit. Again, building up those reasons to actually hit Avenger's Shield, not only are you getting some defensive buffs, as we previously mentioned, you're also getting CDR. Even with that CDR, this is going to be your longest offensive CD, so just keep that in mind when using it. Rounding out the Paladin kit are a few different immunity abilities which have varying uses and can be extremely powerful in specific situations. Starting with Divine Shield, when paired with the Final Stand talent, this actually allows you to tank mobs while that immunity is active, something that otherwise isn't possible, making it the strongest defensive in the game as you're just outright immune to all damage, and it removes and prevents any debuffs from going onto you, something that is looking to be quite strong in a few dungeons this season. Without that talent, it just is an immunity, so it can still be used to clear those debuffs. It can be used to prevent incoming damage, but mobs will stop hitting you unless you specifically individually taunt them. So not something that can be used when you are tanking in an AoE situation. Besides this, you also have Blessing of Protection and Blessing of Spell Warding, which both share a cooldown, so you can only use one and they both go on CD, and these help you against physical and magic damage and debuffs respectively. Be careful with Blessing of Protection though, as it will also cause you to drop aggro, so if you want to use it to remove something like bleeds on yourself when you're actively tanking, you can use like a cancel or a macro to immediately remove it, but again, this is sketchy in AoE situations when you can only taunt one target. Spell Warding does not have that same problem though, as mobs are still able to melee you while you've put Spell Warding on yourself, which makes it really strong in Mythic Plus situations, particularly when there's mobs that are applying magic debuffs to you, or there's a lot of bolter mobs that are shooting into you. Both of these also can be used on other players, similar to Blessing of Sacrifice, so this gives you a lot of options to also help out allies, which is one of the biggest strengths of Paladins. To finish off, we can quickly go through stuff like stats and gearing in Season 3 with more in-depth info available in that method guide. Starting with stats, as always, item level is the most important thing for tanks because of the increase you're getting in strength, stamina, and armor, so that is always #1 priority. From there, having a healthy amount of haste is important as it reduces your global cooldown, as well as the cooldown of many of your core abilities, including things like Judgment, Avenger's Shield, and Hammer of Wrath. Past this, you have two options of where you want to go. For Mythic Plus players that are pushing dangerous key levels, you will likely want to hit your spell block cap first, which requires you to get enough mastery to hit 52% block passively, which is about 10,800 rating if you do not have Shaman buff. How this works basically is that 52% combines with 3 different block talents that we've mentioned. So there's the improved Holy Shield, which is passive 8% spell block. There's Barricade of Faith, which is that 10% block for 10 seconds after Avenger's Shield. And then there's that Faith in the Light big 30% block for 6 seconds after Word of Glory. You add all that up to 52%, which you already have, and that is 100% spell block, meaning any spells, any dots, that is guaranteed to be mitigated by your block. Extremely powerful in the dungeon environment. In raid, this is much less important because your general defensive cooldown rotation can usually cover most of the incoming damage, and so in that situation, you're likely to prioritize crit over any mastery at all, and then you can get mastery secondary. And then for a Mythic Plus environment where you are getting spell block, you want to hit that spell block, then you prioritize crit, and then you prioritize further mastery beyond that bonus. And then, of course, lastly, we have versatility, which is not a super valuable stat for paladins, in my opinion. Of course, remember, for exact damage calculation of stats, you can just sim your character. This is just an approximation. Moving towards embellishments, Dawn Thread is looking to be a very powerful option this tier, assuming you can maintain 80-ish% uptime. And while that sounds like it's a high number, it's actually a pretty feasible goal, even in difficult content. And the upside is that Dawn Thread gives you some defensiveness over the other option, which is Elemental Focusing Gem, which is just pure damage. If you don't want to deal with that uptime or you're worried about it, just play those focusing lenses. And honestly, embellishments are so tiny in terms of their overall output anyways, it's not really a huge deal. Regardless of what you choose, though, make sure you are careful where you are crafting this season, because there's a lot more dead slots with the artifact cape, as well as the boots from the raid that empower that cape. So when you're crafting, it's likely going to be on bracers, belt, or just whatever tier off piece that you're using. When it comes to trinkets, that's something I'm going to leave in the method guide, as I've written out a lot of thoughts on them around all the relevant trinkets, how they perform, in what situations I'd recommend you use them, and recapping that is just going to be way too long. So check that section in the method guide out, and keep in mind, I will update it if they ever tune trinkets, so that's going to stay accurate. But that just about wraps up this video, guys. Hopefully it was helpful, and if it was, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more tank, Mythic Plus, and raid guide content. As always, shout out to my amazing Patreons for their continued support, and I'll see everyone in the next video.